They didn't destroy us. That was their first mistake. They had the power to end it. Every warship, every orbital platform, every weapon system in the known galaxy aimed at one small, stubborn species clinging to a single star. They had the numbers. They had the range. They had the unanimous vote of every elder civilization that had ever looked at humanity and felt something they refused to name, something that wasn't quite fear but lived in the same neighborhood, and they chose exile instead. Think about what that decision reveals. Not mercy. Don't mistake it for mercy. It was arrogance dressed in the language of mercy. It was the quiet confidence of a power so certain of its own permanence that it couldn't imagine the thing it was releasing back into the dark would ever matter again. They looked at a broken species, stripped of its ships, stripped of its colonies, stripped of every technological advantage it had spent 3 centuries building beyond the heliosphere. And they saw something finished. Something that would fade quietly into the background radiation of a galaxy too vast and too busy to notice one more species learning to accept its limits. They had never studied what happens to humans when you take everything. Here is what your history has always known. What every empire that ever tried to contain this species learned too late. You do not extinguish human ambition by removing its fuel. You concentrate it. You compress 300 years of exploration, of reaching, of looking up at the dark and deciding to go there anyway. You compress all of that into a closed system with no outlet except forward. And what you get is not a species grieving, its losses. What you get is a species that has just been handed a reason. A single, undeniable, generational reason that every child born under that locked sky will understand before they can speak it. We are coming back. The galaxy misread silence for surrender. That is the oldest mistake power makes. It sees quiet and calls it compliance. It sees stillness and calls it defeat. It cannot conceive that the thing it silenced simply stopped wasting energy on noise and started spending every joule on something the galaxy would not see coming until it was already there. Humanity doesn't break under pressure. That is the truth carved into every century of your history. Into every moment a door was closed on this species and the species turned around and built another one. Humanity compresses. It goes internal. It gets dangerously, methodically, obsessively, patient. And then it moves. They gave humanity the one thing no comfortable civilization ever gives its rivals. Time with nothing left to protect, nothing left to perform, nothing left to lose. Just a locked door, a clear target, and the particular fury of a species that has never once looked at the word impossible and heard anything other than a suggestion. That was their first mistake. They let us live. The chamber held thousands. Not hundreds, thousands. Every elder race that had ever carved its name into the stone of galactic history, every empire that had spent millennia building the architecture of civilized space, every species that had looked out at the stars and decided collectively that order was worth defending, all of them seated, all of them watching, all of them waiting for the same verdict. And in the center of all that accumulated power, all that ancient authority, all that certainty, one species, young by every measurable standard, volatile by every diplomatic record, impossible to assimilate, impossible to intimidate, impossible to simply absorb into the comfortable machinery of the Accord the way every other civilization eventually had been. Humans. The charges were read without drama, because the evidence required none. Aggression, unpredictability, systematic resistance to Accord authority in no fewer than 47 documented confrontations across 6 decades of expansion, refusal to submit resource extraction rights in contested sectors, unilateral military action on 3 separate occasions without council authorization. And underneath all of it, the charge no diplomat would say aloud but every delegate understood. Humanity was simply too much, too loud, too fast, too unwilling to learn its place in a hierarchy that had functioned smoothly for 10,000 years before humans ever left their atmosphere. Not a single charge was false. Not one. The vote was unanimous. Not close. Unanimous. Every civilization, In that chamber, from the eldest to the most recently admitted, raised its hand against one species and called it justice. They called it necessary. They called it the only responsible decision available to a galactic order that had extended patience, extended diplomacy, extended every instrument of measured restraint it possessed, and watched humanity treat every extension as an invitation to push further. What happened next was efficient in the way that only true institutional power can be efficient. Every human vessel operating beyond the heliopause was intercepted within 72 hours. Every colony humanity had built across 3 centuries of relentless expansion, dismantled, cleared, returned to neutral status as though human hands had never touched the soil. Every alliance, every trade agreement, every diplomatic relationship humanity had spent generations cultivating with smaller, less powerful civilizations, dissolved overnight by a document that none of those smaller civilizations had the standing to refuse signing. 300 years of reach, erased in 72 hours. That is what organized power looks like when it decides something must end. And then the galaxy celebrated. Not quietly, not privately, openly, with the specific relief of something that had been dreaded for a long time and was finally resolved. They raised monuments. They wrote the history books immediately, while the ink was still wet and the narrative still controllable, calling it the Great Relief, calling it the moment galactic civilization chose maturity over conflict. They poured humanity back into its little blue cradle, sealed the door, and went back to the business of being comfortable. Not one of them looked back. For 80 years, the galaxy heard nothing from Earth. Not a reduced signal. Not a weakened transmission struggling against the quarantine perimeter. Not the muffled noise of a civilization still trying to be heard through a door that had been locked against it. Nothing. Complete, total, unbroken silence from the species that had spent 3 centuries being the loudest, most disruptive, most persistently present force in galactic politics. The species that had never once in all its documented history of contact with other civilizations demonstrated the capacity to stay quiet when it had something to say, and it always had something to say, had simply stopped. The conclave's monitoring stations registered the silence and reported it upward. The intelligence divisions analyzed it and filed their assessments. The diplomatic corps reviewed those assessments and reached the conclusion that felt most comfortable, most consistent with the story the galaxy had already decided to tell about itself. Humanity had accepted its fate. The fight had gone out of it. Exile had done what exile was designed to do. It had taken a species that burned too hot and too fast and had let time do the cooling work that force would have made complicated. The Yivari ambassador said it plainly. At a summit convened in year 40 of the exile, in a hall full of civilizations that had spent 4 decades congratulating themselves on a problem solved. The humans have gone quiet, she said. This is what maturity looks like. They are becoming what they should have always been. Irrelevant. The hall responded with the particular applause of people who needed to hear exactly that, who had been waiting for someone with sufficient authority to say the thing they had all been privately thinking and make it feel like wisdom rather than wishful thinking. Here is what none of them asked. Not one delegate, not one intelligence analyst, not one diplomatic observer across 80 years of monitoring that silence ever asked the question that should have been the first question, the only question, the question that changes everything. The moment you take it seriously, what is a species like humanity doing with its silence? Because silence is not a single thing. It does not mean one thing across all contexts, all species, all circumstances. There is the silence of the defeated, hollow, passive, the silence of something that has stopped because it has nothing left to drive it. And there is another silence entirely. The silence of something that has decided, with complete deliberateness, to stop broadcasting its intentions, to stop spending energy on noise that announces its position and start spending every available resource on movement that will not be detected until it is too late to respond to. One of those silences is a surrender. The other is a strategy. The galaxy heard 80 years of nothing and called it the first kind. It was the second kind. It had been the second kind from the very first day the quarantine sealed and humanity turned away from the locked door, looked inward at everything it still had, and started building in the dark. Here is the brutal truth the galaxy never modeled, never wargamed, never fed into a single simulation across 80 years of comfortable certainty. You cannot exile a species from the stars and expect it to forget the stars exist. You can take the ships, you can dismantle the colonies, you can scrub every human footprint from every rock and moon and orbital station beyond the heliosphere and return it all to neutral status as though 3 centuries of expansion never happened. You can do all of that with perfect institutional efficiency and call it a clean resolution. What you cannot do, what no power in the history of any civilization has ever successfully done, is remove the knowledge from the minds of the EO species you contained. The engineers still know what they built. The physicists still know what they discovered. The military strategists still carry in their heads every weakness they identified in every alien weapons platform they ever encountered, every tactical vulnerability they logged and never got to exploit, every innovation they were developing. When the verdict came down and the ships were seized mid-construction, you didn't exile humanity's reach, you compressed it. You took everything pointing outward and forced it to point inward, and you gave it a deadline measured in generations, and you walked away thinking the problem was solved. Every night for 80 years, every human child on every continent looked up at the same sky and saw the same locked door. And here is what you need to understand about what that does to a generation, about what that does to the psychology of an entire civilization raised inside a quarantine it did not choose and would not accept. It does not produce resignation. Resignation requires the belief that the door is permanently locked, that the verdict is not just current but eternal, that the civilizations on the other side of that door are not just more powerful but more permanent. Children raised under that sky did not believe that. They were not taught to believe that, because the adults who raised them did not believe it either, and children absorb the deepest convictions of their culture long before they absorb its explicit lessons. What that sky produced, night after night, generation after generation, was architects, not dreamers, architects. People who looked at a problem with fixed parameters and finite resources and asked not whether it could be solved but how, specifically, methodically, with what sequence of steps and what allocation of available capacity. People for whom the question of whether humanity would return was already closed, already answered, already assumed. So the only question worth spending intelligence on was the question of how to make the return impossible to stop. The unified planetary government that formed in year 3 of the exile was not a political achievement. It was an engineering decision. Every resource war that had consumed human energy for centuries ended, not because humanity had become peaceful, but because it had become focused. Every joule that had gone into internal conflict was redirected. Every gram of rare material, every hour of every engineer, physicist, tactician, and strategist who understood what the galaxy had done and what it would take to answer it. This is the mindset shift that changes everything, the one that separates the species that get back up from the species that don't. The wound becomes the blueprint. The thing that was taken becomes the precise specification for what must be built. Humanity did not spend 80 years mourning its losses. It spent 80 years converting those losses into an exact engineering requirement. And then it built to that requirement with the particular intensity of people who had been given nothing to do except prove a point across the span of their entire lives. In year 79 of the exile, the last ship rolled out of the shipyards of Mars, and the count reached 1,200. Not 1,200 in the way the galaxy would have counted ships before the exile. Not 1,200 vessels of varying age and capability and purpose, some built for exploration, some for trade, some for the kind of symbolic military presence that great powers maintain more for political signaling than actual warfare. 1,200 ships built for one thing, designed from the first drawing to the final weld with the singular clarity of a civilization that had spent 80 years asking a single engineering question. What does it take to walk back through a door that the most powerful coalition in galactic history locked against you and make certain it never gets locked again? The answer to that question was not found quickly. It was not found in year 1, when the grief was still raw and the rage was still loud enough to drown out the kind of cold, precise thinking that produces genuinely dangerous technology. It was not found in year 20, when the first generation, born under the quarantine, was still young, still learning, still developing the technical foundation that the ambition required. It was found slowly, iteratively, through decades of failures that were never publicized and breakthroughs that were never broadcast, in shipyards and laboratories and military research facilities that operated under a classification so total that even the people working in adjacent programs did not know what their neighbors were building. What emerged from that process was not an extrapolation of what humanity had built before the exile. That is the critical thing to understand. The thing that made the fleet not just large but genuinely unprecedented. The Galactic Conclave's strategic models, to whatever extent they considered the possibility of human rearmament at all, assumed that humanity would rebuild along familiar lines, that the ships humanity produced in isolation would be recognizable variants of the ships that had been seized at the verdict, updated perhaps, improved incrementally, but fundamentally, legible to the species that had studied human military technology for 3 centuries of uneasy coexistence. Those models were wrong in the most complete way a model can be wrong. They were not off by a margin. They were operating on entirely the wrong assumptions about what 80 years of isolated, unified, obsessively focused development produces when the civilization doing the developing has nothing to protect its progress from except its own standards. The drive systems alone would have rewritten the accepted physics of faster-than-light travel that the Conclave had considered settled science for 4,000 years. Not improved, rewritten. Built not by refining existing theory but by starting from different axioms entirely, by physicists who had no access to galactic consensus and therefore no psychological investment in defending it, who approached the problem with the specific freedom of people who had never been taught what was supposed to be impossible. The weapon systems were worse from the perspective of anything that might have to face them. Designed not by studying human military history but by studying the enemy. Every alien weapons platform ever encountered across 3 centuries of expansion, every tactical doctrine, every known vulnerability in every known system, all of it catalogued, analyzed, and methodically countered by strategists who had nothing else to do and no deadline except the one that mattered. They named the fleet Verdict, not as provocation, as precision. Because that is what it was, not a military force in the conventional sense, not a tool of conquest or a demonstration of recovered strength, a formal response to a formal proceeding. An answer, delivered 80 years late and 1,200 ships strong, to the chamber that had voted unanimously and celebrated, and written its history books and assumed the matter was permanently closed. The fleet was the rebuttal that no galactic legal framework had ever anticipated. Because no galactic legal framework had ever needed to account for the possibility that the species it had judged would spend 8 decades building the capacity to make the judgment irrelevant. There was no announcement. Understand what that choice meant. Because it was a choice, deliberate and considered, made by people who had spent 80 years thinking about this moment in more detail than any other. Single decision in human history, there were those who argued for the broadcast, who believed that the return should be preceded by a declaration, a statement of intent, a formal notification to the Conclave that humanity was coming back and coming back changed, that the species they had locked away was not the species now standing at the door. The argument had logic behind it. It had the logic of every diplomatic tradition humanity had ever participated in, every protocol of civilized engagement that said you announce yourself before you arrive. You give the other party time to respond. You demonstrate by the very act of prior communication that you are operating within a framework of shared norms. That argument lost, and the reason it lost reveals something essential about what 80 years of exile had produced in the human strategic mind, something the galaxy had not anticipated and could not have, because it required a quality that comforts systematically, destroys, and only prolonged, purposeful pressure can build. The absolute refusal to seek validation from the power that wronged you before you have made its validation irrelevant. An announcement would have been a request. Not formally, not in its explicit content, but structurally, in the very act of sending it. It would have said, however subtly, that humanity still operated within a framework where the Conclave's awareness and preparation mattered, where, The Galactic Order's response was something to be managed and anticipated and accommodated. It would have reinserted humanity into the logic of the system that had exiled it, and humanity had spent 80 years building the capacity to operate outside that logic entirely. So instead, the fleet moved. Quietly, without transmission, without the gravitational signature that standard FTL transit would have produced, because the new drive systems did not produce standard gravitational signatures, which was itself a statement, a demonstration delivered not in words but in physics. The first indication any conclave monitoring station had of what was happening was not a signal. It was a presence. 1,200 ships materialized at the border of the inner reach the way a fact materializes, not announced, not negotiated, simply suddenly and completely true in a way that made the question of whether you were prepared for it entirely beside the point. Admiral Yara Chen, commanding from the flagship Consequence, and that name too was a choice, precise and intentional, sent exactly one transmission to the Elder Assembly after the fleet had taken its position, not before. After. When the tactical displays across every conclave member civilization were already showing 1,200 contacts at the heart of galactic space. When the scrambling had already begun and the emergency sessions were already convening and the question of how to respond was already pressing and unanswered, the transmission came into that chaos like a hand placed flat on a table. 7 words. We have returned. Adjust your history books. No threat. No demand. No list of grievances accumulated across 80 years of exile that might have filled volumes and would have been entirely justified. 7 words that did something more devastating than any ultimatum could have done. They declined to treat the conclave as an entity whose recognition humanity required. They did not say we are here, and we are angry. They did not say you will answer for what you did. They said, with the specific calm of a species that had already decided the outcome before it arrived, that the historical record needed correction, not that humanity demanded correction, that the record required it, as a matter of simple accuracy, the way you correct a calculation that produced the wrong result. The silence that followed on galactic communication channels lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy stared at their screens and tried to locate, somewhere in their institutional memory, somewhere in 10,000 years of accumulated diplomatic experience, a framework for what they were looking at. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. What humanity had just done had no precedent in galactic history, not because no species had ever returned from exile, but because no species had ever returned from exile as though the exile had been a gift. They expected rage. That is the thing you have to understand about what the Conclave had prepared for, about what 80 years of strategic modeling and contingency planning had produced in the war rooms of every major civilization. In the galaxy, they expected a species returning on fire, returning loud. Returning with the accumulated grievance of 3 generations of exile converted directly into aggression, the way every other species in galactic history had converted accumulated grievance into aggression. Because that is what the historical record showed. That is what the behavioral models predicted. That is what 10,000 years of interspecies conflict had established as the default architecture of revenge. They had built their defensive formations around that expectation, positioned their capital ships to absorb and respond to offensive action, prepared their diplomatic channels for the kind of furious opening demands that an aggrieved species makes when it finally has the power to make demands, the long list, the impossible terms, the theater of dominance that is really just pain given a political vocabulary. They were ready for a species that wanted to hurt them back. Ready in the military sense, ready in the diplomatic sense, ready in the psychological sense of having already decided that whatever humanity brought through that door was the understandable, if regrettable consequence of a verdict that had perhaps been implemented too harshly, what they were not ready for. What no amount of modeling could have prepared them for was a species that had spent 80 years becoming something categorically different from the thing they were braced against. The fleet did not fire. That was the first shock, and it moved through the Conclave's command structures like a tremor because every probability model had assigned near certainty to an immediate offensive action. The ships held their positions with a stillness that was somehow more unsettling than movement would have been. The stillness of something that is not waiting for permission and is not suppressing an impulse but has simply already decided that violence is not the most effective instrument available to it in this particular moment. That distinction between restraint and strategy is invisible from the outside, but its consequences are completely different, and the species watching from across the tactical divide felt the difference even if they could not name it. What followed was surgical in a way that revealed the full depth of what 80 years of focused preparation actually meant. Not the broad surgery of a species trying to make a point through destruction. The precise surgery of a species that had studied the problem long enough to know exactly which cuts to make and in which order. Every blockade installation around Sol, removed. Not destroyed, removed. With the specific care of something being returned to its owner rather than something being obliterated in anger. Every seized colony, reclaimed through a sequence of operations so clean and so thoroughly pre-planned that the Conclave's response forces arrived at each location to find the transfer already complete, the human flag already raised, the window for intervention already closed. Every monitoring station humanity had endured for 80 years, dismantled and left in neat pieces at the coordinates where they had stood, which was itself a message, delivered without words, about the difference between what humanity could have done and what it chose to do. And then the fleet moved to the center, to the seat of galactic governance, to the physical location of the Accord's administrative apparatus, to the symbolic heart of the civilization that had voted unanimously to make humanity irrelevant, and it parked, with the same deliberate calm it had maintained from the moment of arrival, not surrounding the complex in a way that communicated siege, positioning itself in a way that communicated permanence. There is a difference, and it matters, and the Conclave's leadership understood the difference immediately and felt it in a place that diplomatic training does not reach. The new Accord arrived in the Elder Assembly's systems 40 minutes later. Not a request for renegotiation, not a list of amendments to the existing framework. A complete document, fully drafted, covering every dimension of humanity's relationship with galactic civilization going forward. Sovereignty, territorial, rights, resource access, military standing, voting weight in conclave proceedings. Written with the legal precision of people who had spent decades anticipating this exact moment and had prepared accordingly. The terms were not punitive. That was perhaps the most disorienting thing about them. They were not designed to humiliate or to extract maximum penalty for the exile. They were designed to be correct, to establish a relationship between humanity and the galactic order that accurately reflected the actual balance of power and the actual qualities of the species, now presenting itself for membership on its own terms. Every delegate in that chamber looked at the document, looked at the tactical display, looked at 1,200 ships crewed by the most purposeful species the galaxy had ever underestimated, and did the only calculation that mattered. They signed. Here is the moment that should stop you completely. Not the fleet. Not the return. Not the 7 words or the signed accord or the surgical precision of a species that came back having solved every problem its exile had created. The moment that should stop you is the one that precedes all of it. The moment in year 1 of the exile when humanity had nothing. No ships, no colonies, no allies, no standing in any galactic institution, no leverage of any kind in any negotiation. With any power that might have intervened on its behalf, nothing except a locked sky, a planet, and the specific quality of mind that decides, in the absence of everything external, to go internal and start building from whatever remains. The galaxy had every advantage. Let that land with the full weight it deserves. Numbers that dwarfed anything humanity could produce in a single generation. Technology that had been developing and refining for 10,000 years before humans ever achieved spaceflight. Time, the most underestimated advantage of all, the advantage that compounds everything else, that allows institutional knowledge to accumulate and strategic patience to develop and the kind of civilizational confidence that comes from having survived every challenge the universe has presented across a history so long it makes human civilization look like an afternoon. Allies numbering in the hundreds, species bound to the conclave by treaties and trade dependencies and shared interest, in a stable order. A century's head start in every arms race that mattered, and they still lost the standoff. Not by a narrow margin. Not in a close contest where the outcome could have gone either way and humanity happened to catch a favorable circumstance. They lost it completely, cleanly, in a way that left no ambiguity about the result and no face-saving narrative available to the civilization that had written humanity's epitaph 80 years earlier and been wrong about every word of it. The reason was not luck. Dismiss that immediately. Luck is what comfortable people invoke when they cannot bear to examine the more demanding explanation. The reason was not a miracle weapon, not a fortunate discovery, not some asymmetric technology that happened to neutralize the conclave's advantages in a way that couldn't be replicated or predicted. Those explanations are comforting because they suggest the outcome was exceptional, unrepeatable, specific to a set of circumstances that don't translate to anything outside themselves. The real explanation is more confronting than that. It translates everywhere. It applies to every domain, every scale, every context in which a species or a person or an organization finds itself outmatched on every conventional metric and chooses, against all apparent logic, to compete anyway. Focus. Singular, unrelenting. Generational focus from a civilization that made one decision in year one and never unmade it. The decision that the exile was not a verdict about what humanity was, but a set of conditions under which humanity would become something the galaxy had no category for yet. That kind of focus is not a talent. This is the thing that your entire understanding of capability and potential needs to absorb. Because you have been told your whole life that extraordinary outcomes require extraordinary gifts, that the gap between where you are and where you could be is fundamentally a gap in what you were born with. It is not. The gap is almost never that. The gap is almost always this. The people who produce extraordinary outcomes decided, at some specific moment under some specific pressure, to stop distributing their energy across everything that competed for it and redirect it, all of it, toward one thing that mattered more than their comfort, more than their reputation, more than the approval of every voice around them saying the target was unreachable. Humanity's exile was the pressure that forced that decision at a civilizational scale. Every internal competition for resources resolved. Every distraction from the primary objective eliminated. Every debate about direction ended by the simple clarity of a species that had only one direction available and had spent enough time staring at it to stop being afraid of how far away it was. You are not facing an exile, but you are facing something. You have been facing it long enough to know exactly what it is. The door that was closed against you, the verdict that was handed down, the system or person or circumstance that looked at what you were building and decided it didn't belong. And somewhere between that moment and this one, you made a decision about what that obstacle meant. Either it meant the story was over, or it meant the story was just entering the part where the building begins. The galaxy had every advantage, and lost because one species answered that question correctly under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The question is not whether you have enough. You have been asking the wrong question your entire life. The question is what you are pointing what you have at, and whether you have the specific, uncomfortable, socially inconvenient will to keep pointing it there when nothing around you confirms that it's working yet. The Yvari ambassador who stood in that hall in year 40 and called humanity irrelevant lived to see year 81. She was old by then, old even by the standards of a species whose lifespan made human generations look like seasons, and she had spent the decades between that speech and this moment accumulating the particular confidence of someone whose predictions had been validated by events, whose read of a situation had proven correct, whose institutional authority rested in part on the record of having assessed the human problem accurately and publicly when others were still uncertain. She had built a career on the Great Relief. She had written monographs. She had advised 3 successive conclave administrations on the settled question of soul quarantine management, which required less and less attention with every passing decade because there was less and less to manage. She was in the chamber when the transmission came through. She watched the tactical display populate with 1,200 contacts at the inner reach border. She heard 7 words read aloud into a silence so complete that the chamber's atmospheric systems were audible for the first time anyone could remember. And she said nothing, not because she had nothing to say in the conventional sense, but because the specific kind of nothing she said in that moment was the nothing of a person whose entire framework for understanding a situation has just been invalidated at the root, not amended, not challenged at the margins, but pulled out from underneath every conclusion she had built on top of it. She had made the mistake. The precise, identifiable, completely avoidable mistake that she had made not once in a speech but consistently, institutionally, across 4 decades of policy built on a single misreading. She had looked at silence and called it surrender. She had looked at a species stripped of its external capacity and concluded that the capacity was the species, that what humanity could do in space was what humanity was, and that removing the doing removed the being. She had confused the instrument with the intention behind it, and that confusion, replicated across every intelligence service and strategic planning division and diplomatic corps in the conclave, had produced 80 years of looking in the wrong direction, while the most important development in galactic history was happening in plain sight on a quarantined planet that nobody was watching closely enough to see. This is the mistake every empire makes, not just galactic empires. Every empire, every institution, every concentration of established power that has ever looked at a disruption and decided it was manageable, every comfortable system that has ever encountered something genuinely new and processed it through the categories it already had rather than developing the new categories the situation required. They measure threat by current capacity. They assess danger by visible resources. They look at what something has right now and extrapolate forward along a line that assumes the conditions producing the current state will continue to produce similar states indefinitely. What that model cannot account for, what it is structurally incapable of accounting for, is transformation. The possibility that the conditions you imposed on something are not suppressing it but changing it, fundamentally and irreversibly, into something that will not behave according to any projection based on what it was before those conditions were applied. The conclave's models were excellent at predicting what a contained humanity would do if it remained essentially the same humanity that had been contained. They had no model for what humanity would become if containment itself became the engine of its development. Every bully in the history of your own species has made this error. Every authority that ever tried to diminish someone by removing their platform, their resources, their visible markers of legitimacy, operating on the assumption that the platform was the source of the power, that the resources were what made the person dangerous, that stripping the external would neutralize the internal. It never does, not when the internal is the kind that responds to pressure by going deeper rather than collapsing, the kind that treats removal as information about what needs to be built, rather than evidence that building is impossible. The lesson, the galaxy, learned in year 81, is the lesson your own history has tried to teach through every chapter where the supposedly finished rose and the supposedly permanent fell, that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is not the opponent who is loudly powerful but the opponent who went quiet and you stopped watching, that the most consequential period in any underdog's development is not the period of visible struggle but the period of invisible preparation that follows the moment they stopped explaining themselves to people who weren't listening. That pressure applied to the determined does not diminish them. It defines them, strips away everything peripheral, everything performed, everything maintained for external consumption, and leaves only what was always real, concentrated now to a density that nothing applied from outside can match. The galaxy thought it had written humanity's final chapter. It had written humanity's origin story. Now the story turns. Because everything that has been said until this moment, every word about exile and silence and 80 years of building in the dark and 1,200 ships and 7 words delivered into a galactic silence, all of it has been pointing at something that has nothing to do with a species you will never meet and everything to do with the life you are living right now, today, in whatever specific circumstances brought you to this moment and this story and this particular intersection of a narrative about humanity with the narrative you carry about yourself. You are here because something in this story recognized you, not the fleet, not the return, the exile, The part where everything was taken, or the part where the silence stretched longer than anyone around you thought was sustainable, or the part where the galaxy looked at what you were and voted, not always formally, not always loudly but unmistakably, that you were too much, or not enough, or simply inconvenient to an order that had already decided how things were supposed to work and where you were supposed to fit inside that arrangement. You recognize that part because you have lived a version of it. Everyone who finds this story finds it for that reason. So here is the question that has been building underneath every section of this script, the question that the entire history of humanity's exile and return was constructed to deliver directly into the center of your thinking, where it cannot be dismissed or deferred or processed into something more comfortable. What are you building in the silence? Not what are you planning? Not what do you intend when circumstances improve or resources increase or the door that was locked against you finally opens from the outside through some intervention you are waiting for. What are you building right now, today, with what you actually have in the conditions that actually exist, toward the thing that actually matters most to you? The thing you stopped talking about publicly because the gap between where you are and where that thing lives became too embarrassing to keep announcing to people who were watching to see if you would close it. Because here is the brutal truth that this entire story has been building toward, the truth that separates the species that return from the ones that don't, the truth that applies at every scale from galactic civilizations to individual human lives with the same relentless consistency. The exile does not end from the outside. Nobody opens the door. No conclave reverses its verdict out of belated fairness. No institution that has organized itself around your absence decides, through the operation of its own conscience, to reorganize itself around your presence. The door opens because you build something on your side of it that makes the door irrelevant, that makes the question of whether it will be opened from the outside a question you no longer need answered because you have stopped requiring their permission to matter. This is the mindset shift. Not a motivational adjustment, not a reframing of your current situation into something that feels better while producing the same results. A fundamental restructuring of where you locate the source of your forward motion. Humanity did not spend 80 years petitioning the conclave for reconsideration. It did not maintain diplomatic channels on the hope that the elder races would eventually recognize the injustice of the verdict and act accordingly. It turned its back on the door completely. Not in bitterness, not in the performative defiance of something that is actually still defined by what it is defying, but with the clean, purposeful indifference of something that has found a more productive use for its attention and its energy and its time. Most people never make that turn. This is the hardest truth in this entire script, harder than anything about the fleet or the verdict or the 11 minutes of galactic silence. Most people spend their entire lives in a hybrid state, partly building, partly still waiting for the validation of the power that exiled them, partly moving forward and partly still oriented toward the locked door, hoping that the movement will be noticed and recognized by the very system that decided they were irrelevant. That hybrid state is the thing that keeps the door locked, because you cannot build with full capacity while any portion of your attention remains pointed at the people whose approval you have decided you no longer need but have not yet actually stopped needing. The closing line of this story is not about humanity. It is addressed to you, specifically, in whatever room you are sitting in, with whatever version of an exile you have been living, with whatever fleet you have been quietly, slowly, perhaps almost imperceptibly assembling in the years, since the verdict came down and the door closed and the galaxy moved on and assumed you would too. Go quiet. Deliberately, strategically, completely quiet. Stop broadcasting the struggle and start converting it. Take every resource that remains, and something always remains. That is the one thing the galaxy consistently fails to account for, and point it, all of it, without division and without apology, and without the need for a single external voice to confirm that the direction is correct, at the one thing that matters most. Build the fleet, not as a metaphor to carry warmly through your week and set down when it becomes inconvenient. As a commitment, as the decision that reorganizes every other decision around it, as the thing you are doing when no one is watching and no one is applauding and the silence stretches long enough that everyone who is paying attention assumes you have finally accepted your place. The most terrifying thing you will ever become is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the one that went silent and came back with a fleet. Now go build it.